Hey, good morning and good evening for whoever else all over the world. We are lucky that since this is virtual, it can be accessible by you wherever you are. So as Clara said, I'm a bencher of Lincoln's Inn and a member of a newly formed committee. It was a steering group before that, but now we have the status of committee because of the important issues that arise. And today I'm hosting what is a continuation of our EDI forums. It was nearly a year till our first forum, BAME and COVID, and that was our first look at events of the pandemic, and in particular how it affected ethnic minorities. And we also were touching in that forum the events around the world at the time, because obviously we had George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. So now, after what I would say has been a remarkable and unusual year, we aim to look at providing an update on the experience of ethnic minority barristers, and including how COVID has impacted the progress in diversity on entry, first of all, and secondly on the distribution of work, and the particular emphasis on the publicly funded bar, where a larger proportion of ethnic minority barristers do practice. And so we aim to give an idea and indication of the legacy insofar as recruitment and retention, and what progress has been made, what lessons learned, if indeed they have been learned, and what areas require attention for the future. We're lucky today, we have a really great panel, two of which are returning from our first forum, and one new member, which I'm delighted to have on board. First of all, we've got Natasha Shotunde, amongst other things, for those who don't know her, a member of the Bar Race Working Group, co-founder of the Black Barristers Network. And Natasha, that must be going from strength to strength. I hear great things that are occurring.
Yes, fantastic things are happening with BBN. This year, we won an award, Chambers Europe Award for the best organisation group in Europe. So yeah, no, we're doing.
Wow. Yeah. Well deserved. And now the year on, what events are we looking forward to?
We have done loads of events this year so far. We did one with Chambers and Partners in the Legal 500, because we really want to, as part of our mission statement, promote the growth of Black barristers. So we brought them in, they spoke to us about what we need to do in respect of our applications. And we also asked them questions in respect of diversity and whether and how they hope to improve diversity in their directories. We've also done a number of different events, some of which one was with the Supreme Court to try and get judicial assistance. We did a pupillage event where we had a few barristers who had recently taken pupillage, who were Black, talking about their experiences of pupillage and providing fantastic tips I wish I had at the time. And we're hoping to.
I think you'll do, yeah.
So yeah.
Good, excellent, sounds good. Next on the panel, I'm taking it literally on those who appear on my screen, Sidhu QC, former president of the Society of Asian Lawyers, and since the last forum, vice chair of the CBA. How has that role been during these challenging times?
I mean, we're living through extraordinary times, aren't we, Neil? All of us have been affected to a lesser or greater degree, and each of the bar associations who have been trying to help their members have been looking for ways in order to mitigate the difficulties and the damage that's been done. The CBA has historically always fought as hard as it can to protect the interests of criminal barristers who as we all know, form the largest cohort of barristers that we have in this country. And so there are many people who either exclusively or partly practicing crime who would have felt over the last year and a half that the changes that they've had to grapple with have sucked the life out of them, to be perfectly honest. It's been extremely difficult territory to operate in for criminal barristers at every level, right from the bottom end with our baby barristers coming in as juniors and right up to the top with the silks as well, not least because of the problems within the justice system and the courts. So the answer to your question really, Neil, is that for the CBA, certainly in my role as Vice Chair and soon to become Chair, we have some huge issues to have to grasp. And we're doing so constructively with all our partners within the criminal justice system. We're doing so with the Ministry of Justice, with the senior judiciary, and all of those partners within the system who are working towards finding a solution that ensures that justice doesn't come off the tracks. So I think we are ready for this continuing challenge, but if I'm being really honest with you, it has been an exhausting process. And I don't pretend for one moment it's just the criminal barristers who've been suffering. Of course, everyone has, and in wider society too. But I do believe very firmly that unless our justice system is able to be resurrected and put into a shape that can deliver for the public, we are facing a crisis that can actually become endemic. And unless we get through the backlog and all the other problems we've got, I'm afraid it's not the most attractive area of law for newcomers to come into. So from the point of view of simply selling the criminal bar as a viable and attractive place for many young people who want to come to the bar, it is a difficult thing to ask them to do because they know they're stepping into a hard arena. But we're certainly not giving up. And I think that there's reason to be optimistic as hopefully we get through this last stage. I hope it's the last stage of the pandemic, and more people get vaccinated, the better, of course. But if we can get through this, there's real light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, tough issues to grapple with, but it's good to see that the work is being done to try and address those. The last member of our panel, Laurie-Anne Power. I know Laurie-Anne from when we did Pupillage 20 years ago. Gosh, that's making me feel old. But since then...
You were a rebel then, Neil.
Yeah, well, thank you. Since then, she's won the 2019 BSN Lawyer of the Year Award. She's on the Bar Council Volunteering for Education, member of the Bar Race Working Group, and also my research tells me on the Race Equalities Committee Chair on the Women in Criminal Law. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
And how did that come about, and what does that involve?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of, the membership to a lot of these committees, specifically dealing with issues of race and diversity, arose obviously out of the events that took place last year. I have been, a member of many committees before that, but I think that it's taken, gained some real traction over the last year or so. And for my part, I've been at the bar for 21 years, and I know that one of the things I found most disconcerting about the profession was the lack of visual representation. The amount of times I would go to meetings, go to my inn, go to educational events, and there wouldn't be anyone that looked like me, no one that I could, relate to. And I'm one person, but I think it's important to have a seat at the table and have a voice in the room. And so I joined a number of committees, obviously Bar Standards Board, Bar Council, my inn, Middle Temple. Women in Criminal Law obviously doubles up because it deals with the issues specifically relating to women and also to women from minority backgrounds. And so for my part, I think it's important for us to be out there, and it's important for us to work together. And so I think if, I'm on a number of groups, I can share the information amongst those groups so that we can come together and try and to improve the position in the landscape. I work with Joe on the Criminal Bar Association. I'm the treasurer of the Criminal Bar Association. And it's been enlightening for me as well, being a member of the Criminal Bar Association, just to see from the inside the kind of work that goes on specifically relating to the progress of our communities. And so, yeah, representation matters, Neil, and I think it's important, even just visually, to see people who look like us, sound like us, and empathise with our positions to be a voice for us.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And so, as you can see, three distinguished panelists, can I just emphasize what Clara said at the start. Whilst I am going to ask some questions, this is ultimately also an event for you lot that are watching. And so if you feel you want to send in your questions, please do so. And it can be done anonymously. And I'm more than happy to ask them, the panelists, what their views are. Let me start off though, a year on, how do you think, and Joe touched on this earlier, how do you think COVID has affected the morale of barristers in general? Natasha, if I start with you.
How has COVID affected the morale of barristers? It's been a really, really tricky one, I think. This whole pandemic has been difficult for everybody. And then with the kind of job that we have, which can be quite isolating at the best of times when we're out and about in court, I think it's made it particularly isolating for us as barristers. Looking at and coupled with the death of George Floyd, the trauma that the Black community in particular went through at that time and after, it's been really, really hard. There has been a lack of support for some people who have faced financial hardship. And indeed, it's been shown that ethnic minorities have been the ones who have suffered the most financial hardship at the bar during this pandemic through the last COVID-19 survey. So it's been really tricky. However, I think there have been some amazing positives that have come from the pandemic. One has been the use of technology, the fact that we use technology so much, not just for webinars like this, but also for courts, has been a godsend, particularly in areas of practice like family, which is what I do. It's enabled barristers to be able to work. So it's been a mixed bag, let's put it that way. But we're coming out of it-ish, learning to live with COVID, not sure. But I feel positive about the future. Yeah,
Laurie-Anne, do you feel positive, and do you agree that this sort of, it's been a mixed ride for barristers over the past year?
Yeah, I think, I endorse everything that Natasha has said. In every aspect of this job, minorities and particularly Black people fare worst. And that has been reflected in the pandemic. And that's obviously not to say that other people haven't suffered, of course they have. But when you consider the impact of the pandemic upon our professional lives, you can't look at that in isolation, because it had a disproportionate impact upon our health. So we're more likely to have been impacted by health issues or be related to people who had suffered or had fatally suffered the consequences of COVID. Finance outside of our incomes in a profession. So family members, the lack of savings, the lack of assets, the lack of financial assistance. And so the cumulative effect of COVID, I think, has been compounded by a workplace and a work environment that had very little sympathy for the attrition that we have long since suffered. I, however, do think, and again, having been invested in the advancement of our communities for my entire career, I have for the very first time seen what I consider to be a genuine and a real determination to try and redress this horrible injustice that we as barristers suffer on a daily basis. And I say that because I have consistently worked with people through a number of organizations and groups, and I see what I consider to be genuine attempts and efforts to make real change. I've never seen that before. Diversity was a buzzword that people used to throw around as though it was, like gentrification, and we've heard it all, and no one's ever really impressed by it. But there are real efforts. People are investing time, effort, and money into making change. So, of a very, very traumatic situation, I think will come a bright future. Not tomorrow, not next year, but certainly there is scope for optimism. I have to say though, I didn't before, but now I realise that being Black and in this job is utterly exhausting. Having to consistently justify why you have to spend time fighting for basic and fair, equitable treatment has astonished me. And, you know, we don't give up. And I think that, you know, with groups like this, you know, events like this, continually pushing, you know, the Black Barristers Network. I only wish we had that when we was coming up. And so, you know, it's a real, I think it's a real good place for us to start. And I think, like Natasha said, there is certainly scope and hope for real optimism and real change.
Yes, as you said, whilst it was there in the past and people were paying often lip service, you felt, to the issues.
Absolutely.
There does feel a sense of, this time, a real purpose, which, as you pointed out, gives the difference. And so that gives us a sense of positivity, I think.
I think we have to have cautious optimism. We can't sleep on it, you know. We can't say, you know, the Bar Council have got a race working group, the Bar Standards Board have got a target, you know, and we carry it. We need to start seeing results. So actually the proof of the pudding is in the eating. If next year, 2022, the Bar Council, Bar Standards Board, you know, reveal their diversity statistics and we're no farther forward than we were last year or the year before, then we know that while people are alive to the issue, the culture hasn't changed. And so it's a case of us making these strides, but having an eye to where the real change counts, and that is seeing people like us advancing, progressing through to the top echelons of the profession. And I think that's going to take time, but we're certainly on the right path.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, Joe, earlier you gave quite a very unfortunate sort of synopsis of how COVID has affected barristers. But would you agree that with Laurie-Anne and Natasha, there's more positivity to be added to that?
I certainly agree that as we are hopefully coming out of this very dark tunnel that we've been walking through for the last number of months since spring of last year, we feel that we're in a better place today than we did, say, even 2 or 3 months ago. I think the way perhaps, Neil, to approach this question of the impact of COVID on us as individual practitioners and more broadly across the bar is to ask ourselves, what has COVID actually done? In my mind, there are 3 things that we want to keep very much at the forefront of our consideration. Firstly, yes, it's true to say that COVID introduced new problems that we hadn't had before, which was a result of the court system grinding effectively to a halt in March of 2020. Secondly, that COVID has accentuated and aggravated pre-existing problems that we had at the bar, and particularly at the publicly funded bar, in a way that has exposed fissures that may have been noticeable to some, but have now become blatantly evident to all. And in some respects, thirdly, COVID hasn't changed anything. So let's just take that in reverse order. The problem of racism at the bar and the particular issues that are grappled with by people of color, whether you're black or brown at the bar, have existed for decades. And we have made Herculean efforts over the last 20 years in particular through the Bar Council, through the CBA, through other specialist bar associations and partners who work with us towards common good ends to try and resolve these problems. And that direction of travel hasn't changed. We were doing it before COVID, we've been doing it during COVID, and we continue to do it as we come out of COVID, or at least out of this current pandemic. And what that means is that there have been institutional changes and cultural changes at the bar more broadly to reflect the fact that diversity is not a bolt-on anymore. Diversity is very much part of the fabric of what we do as an organization of professionals. And it needs to be embedded in a way that it can't be dislodged as a consequence of, for example, economic misfortune. It is not an expendable. So in that sense, what we are witnessing now is actually a continuation of a pre-existing problem that we had got to grips with, but our ability to grapple with the problem of racism and discrimination and disadvantage at the bar, which is suffered by so many different cohorts, whether they are distinguished by their color or by their gender or otherwise, that problem now needs to be resolved with greater urgency. And the reason for that is the context in which we're operating. Neil, the reality is this: We have many people in the publicly funded bar, whether you're doing crime or family or other types of work which are reliant upon state funding, who were struggling even before COVID hit. They were struggling because of the gross underinvestment in our justice system, which was a problem that had been brewing up for so many years. Despite the calls for it to be addressed urgently, it was left to go to sleep as far as primary issues are concerned. Now we are counting the chickens which have come home to roost. We can see the consequences of that underinvestment. When COVID hit, all of that got exposed, laid bare for everyone to see, that we had a backlog before COVID, we had a bigger backlog after COVID. We had people who were struggling with their income levels because they were publicly funded barristers before COVID, who then found that they went into a steep decline from March of 2020 as they couldn't get into court. And as you know, and as we all experienced, the shutdown for a period of time of the court system and the knock-on effect of that shutdown has meant that people's incomes have plummeted. And so when we look at where we go from here, we have to recognize that what COVID has been is a huge wake-up call to us. It's taught us that we live in a very fragile system, which can be upset by things like a pandemic, can be upset by underinvestment, and can be upset by us simply taking our eye off the ball. And what do I mean by that? We think, all of us on this panel, and those I believe who are watching this evening, that diversity is really, really important. It's important because if we don't have diversity at the bar, particularly for those who work in the publicly funded sector, we're going to see a gradual disappearance of all the gains that we made. And they were hard-fought gains, believe you me. Having been at the bar for nearly 30 years and having been on so many committees, I know how difficult it was to get policy changes through the system. And now that we've got those gains, what we want to do is, of course, capitalize on them to equal the playing field, to level it out for everyone concerned. What COVID did was it knocked us sideways. And many people started asking, well, is diversity really that important when we're trying to ensure that we have the survival of the bar for legal aid lawyers? Is it so important to think about diversity? And the answer, of course, is absolutely. Because the very people that we've worked so hard to draw into the bar, whether they come from minority backgrounds or they're women or otherwise, are the very people who are most vulnerable to the consequences of COVID because of the structural imperfections in the bar, because of the fact that so few people from a minority background, for example, are in chancery and commercial work, just 1 to 2%, because of the fact that there's been an overpreponderance of Black and brown barristers in criminal work and in family work, making us especially vulnerable to the vicissitudes of the system. So when we get knocked sideways, it's those people who suffer, who are already suffering. And I'm sure we'll be reminded in the course of the evening of the figures that we have for how Black people in particular at the criminal bar and at the family bar earn far less money than their white and brown comparators. They are not earning what others are earning, and they should be earning the same amount of money at the same level of call. And they are the most vulnerable people because they come into the bar with less financial capital on average than other people. They don't have parents who have a lot of money. They come almost overwhelmingly from a state school education system. Many of them, like white people also, I agree, of course, at the bar, are carrying a huge amount of debt, but they don't have the ability to be able to divest them of those burdens so that they can concentrate on the job in hand. So when we have a decline in income, Neil, I'm afraid to say the consequences are more profound on certain sectors. And that's really what I hope the purpose of tonight's meeting and evening is to really put a spotlight on those who are suffering particularly and what we can do to make things easier to manage for them in particular.
Yes, well, and on that, I'm particularly interested financially and the financial link with the distribution of work amongst ethnic and minority barristers. Laurie-Anne, as a more junior practitioner in crime, has there been an effect, and if so, what?
I think it's very difficult to say across the board, you know, just to kind of generalize. I suspect a lot of it will depend upon the chambers that you're in, how busy that chambers is. But in terms of the quality of work, we just have to look at what the financial figures say, and Black women are paid the lowest of all, followed by Asian women, and not very far behind by Black and Asian men. So the figures speak.
And these are predominantly in crime.
These are predominantly in crime, and I can guarantee you one thing, if I can guarantee you nothing else, that's not going to improve over the next year. And so the likelihood, well, the answer is yes, of course. The problem with the distribution of work isn't related to COVID.
Right.
The distribution of work is an issue that exists from arrests, police station, instructions by solicitors, through the clerk's room, eventually to counsel. And unless you're a black or brown barrister that is lucky enough to have solicitors who contact them directly, or you've been able to build up a practice where you have solicitors who you have direct contact with, where you're dependent upon the clerks for your work and therefore your income, the statistics show us that the clerks are not clerking Black and Asian barristers in the same way that they are clerking white barristers. That's not an opinion, that's a fact. And
Right.
so COVID will necessarily have an impact on that, the disproportionate instructions that are being received, the disproportionate standard and quality of work being received. And so this is not COVID. COVID has just compounded what Joe has already expressed was a pre-existing issue. There needs to be a culture change, a complete culture shift. And again, you know, our regulators are aware of this disproportionate system of instructing Black and Asian barristers. They're aware of it, and they know that it's an issue not just within the clerk's room, but it's an issue that perhaps exists before that. And so, yes, COVID will undoubtedly have an impact upon the quality and the level of work, and therefore the remuneration. But I don't think it's because of COVID. I think that COVID would just make a pre-existing really bad condition even worse. And so what we need to do is go to the root cause of the problem.
Let's stop there.
Yeah.
But before we go on to how we address that, let me just turn to Natasha in family. Have you found that there is a disproportionate distribution of work?
I think it's quite hard to tell because, as I said before, lockdowns have made us quite isolated from chambers, and therefore we don't necessarily know what everybody else is doing. I know in family at the beginning there was a drop off because the courts were closed, and then we went remote quite quickly. So then people started receiving lots of work and went to pretty much pre-pandemic levels of work. But going back to what Laurie-Anne said, I think it's the quality that is the massive question. And we had a problem with the quality, distributing quality work to ethnic minority barristers and Black barristers in particular before the pandemic. It's exacerbated now. And I think it's in part exacerbated because it's hard to challenge. So before, when we were going into chambers, you may be able to find out the type of work that other people were doing because you'd be speaking to them because you'd be in chambers. But now we're not in chambers. We have no idea what people are doing until we see our chambers or whomever tweet the Court of Appeal judgment. And you can see who's getting that work. And then you will know that you're not the one that's getting it. So there's always been a problem with work allocation and lack of transparency anyway before the pandemic, but it's even worse now because we can't even reach out in a more social setting to our colleagues and find out what they're up to. So it's still definitely a massive problem, and it's the problem that it's harder for us to challenge.
Okay, and Joe, as a QC, you should hopefully have the quality of work, but do you think COVID has affected the quantity?
It certainly has, Neil, because of course, as you'll remember in March of last year, when the Lord Chief Justice said that we're going to have to stop the court system because of the way in which COVID was spreading so quickly, a lot of cases were taken out of the list. A lot of cases were postponed. Big multi-handed trials, the sort of stuff that I would ordinarily do, homicides and cases of that nature, they had to be refixed, sometimes shifted to other courts because there wasn't the capacity to hold large trials in certain court buildings whilst also maintaining social distancing. And so there was a huge degree of disruption. And, you know, I don't think Silks in particular would be able to claim that they suffered more than others. I think the suffering was shared pretty broadly. The difference, of course, is that if you are a junior barrister and you're already on a low income, your capacity to be able to weather the storm and actually get through to the other end without becoming bankrupted, using that expression loosely, by the drop in your income is so much lower for someone who's vulnerable. And I think therefore the focus ought to be on who is vulnerable amongst us. And Neil, the point I would make broadly is this. Look, the bar is a large family. And one of the wonderful things about the bar, one of the reasons why I was drawn in my mid-20s to do a complete career change and actually embrace the bar as a place where I'd like to work and have as my vocation, is precisely because I felt it was a place where I could share my experiences with others, where I could be amongst a family of people who could see the world much as I saw the world, to have that same perspective. And it's very interesting that in this time of crisis, when COVID caused all the problems to individual chambers who were trying to recruit pupils, but found that they didn't have the money to pay for them and therefore cut back, that we had that helping hand from some commercial sets who felt actually quite aggrieved for their brothers and sisters working in crime and family, and actually said, well, we're going to fund some of those pupillages so that you don't have a cutback. And it's that sort of sense of responsibility and noblesse oblige, which really marks the bar as the institution that it can be, that when we're in trouble, at least some of us are in trouble, others will come to our aid. So I think what we ought to be looking forwards to is, as we emerge from COVID, how can we reconstitute the bar so as to understand that we are actually one family? We may be divided by practice areas, but we are in fact doing the same sort of job, broadly speaking. And what should we be doing to maintain the overall demographic of the bar so that it is truly diverse? And if pockets of the bar have to help other parts, so be it, that's important. But at the same time, it's a message which has to be heard by government, because government ultimately has a duty itself to ensure that the public are served by a diverse bar and by a diverse judiciary. And that's not going to happen by accident. That requires commitment and investment. And when that investment comes in, we'll be trying to make sure that it is spread evenly so that the weakest amongst us, the most vulnerable amongst us, the ones that we fear are going to vote with their feet and are indeed leaving the bar in significant numbers because of the disappointment they feel not having the support that they should have, that we can reverse that trend and keep the numbers up so that we have a healthy balance of diverse practitioners. That's a long job to do, but the cataclysm that is COVID has really concentrated our minds, Neil, and made us realize how fragile the peace is. We need to make sure going forwards that we entrench those gains and that we have the support both within and without the bar from all our allies and partners so that we can achieve those objectives which are laudable in themselves, to have a diverse bar.
So Laurie-Anne, Joe there outlining some of the effects to address. What more do you feel can be done to address this disproportionately high effect on ethnic minority barristers because of the unfair distribution of work?
Okay, so I think that this is, I think as Natasha said, it's very difficult to police because, of course, the clerks will say, well, the solicitors are asked for a particular barrister and they want that particular barrister. You know, solicitors now have access to our image at the drop of a finger. They go on our profile, they look, they know what you look like, you know, what you do, and they can say, I want that X, Y, Z. And the clerks are not and should not be in a position to say no. So it's very difficult to find a way to address the issue. I think training is needed because the
Training who?
Training the clerks. The clerks need to recognise that there may be cases where solicitors ask for a particular barrister, and when they're offered a barrister that's black or not a white male barrister, they say no and they say no. And I think that clerks need to be aware of that. But I think it's going to be almost impossible to say to the clerks, well, you know, this is your problem. You need to police the distribution of work too much. The way to do it, I think, is to have statistics. First of all, we need empirical data. We need to present chambers with empirical data which demonstrates that there is a significant disproportionate system in terms of distribution going on. Once the data is there, because at the moment it's all anecdotal, isn't it? You know, it's saying, you know, well, there's an issue with clerking. Well, the clerks will say, well, the solicitors asked for who they asked for, and we just distribute the work to who they asked for. And so who is at fault? But once we have the data to demonstrate that as a barrister of the same call, of the same relative experience, is not receiving the same income when they're more or less exclusively being clerked by chambers, there must be an issue there. You know, so I think it's a case of us going back to grassroots and stripping it back. I don't think it's an overnight issue. This is a culture of discriminatory clerking, discriminatory instructions being given by solicitors. It's a culture. And by training one set of clerks in the chambers and saying, well, you know, the black barristers are earning less, there's 101 reasons that they will be able to come up with to say that. Why? You know, so we need to provide them with the data that cannot be refuted, that demonstrates clearly that something is going wrong when the work comes from the solicitor through the clerk's room, and then in terms of the quality of work, we can do that quite easily. Let's have a look at pupils who are taken on as tenants, and you monitor their income for the first 5 years of practice. You know, at that level of call, they're going to be heavily dependent on work that comes through the clerk's room. So if you get to 5 years call, and you have, you know, one black barrister, one white barrister, or whatever number, and there's a significant difference in their income, well, then we know where the problem lies. But unless we have that data to present, it's going to be very difficult to change what is a culture of clerking. So I don't think it's one specific answer. I think it's attacking it from all levels, and I think chambers need to grapple with this problem. Many chambers deny that there is any form of racism or discriminatory behaviour taking place within their chambers. They deny it because it's very difficult to see. A lot of chambers say, well, we have black and brown people in our chambers, we can't possibly discriminate against them. Well, actually, let's have a look at the incomes of those people. Why you may have them in your chambers, but they're the bottom earners. And so we need to compile data amongst different areas, you know, whether it's family, civil, whether it's crime, and we need to be able to demonstrate, again, to our regulators that this is a problem when we think that the data demonstrates that the problem is here, there, and then tailor our approach to the data.
Yeah, in fact, your answer actually was an answer to one of the questions where someone asked, where can we find the statistics for the distribution of work? And it seems that we can't yet.
There's no empirical data. There's none. You know, we need to be able to monitor. Again, these are things that I know the Bar Standards Board looking at behind the scenes, you know, just in terms of trying to address these issues. But again, this is an overnight fix. But I think, yeah, we certainly need to hold the chambers accountable to produce statistics in terms of the income, the progression of their members, and that needs to be broken down into minority groups.
Natasha, do you agree that this is a chambers problem, or do you think it's much wider than that?
I think it's much wider than that, but before I come on to the wider part, just going back to what Laurie-Anne is saying about monitoring work, there's already a requirement for chambers to monitor unallocated work that comes into chambers. So we need to start holding our chambers to account and be like, are you doing this? Because it's a BSB requirement, and the BSB needs to actually start using its teeth and going to chambers and saying, are you doing that? Are you doing it? Because that's not a new thing. That has been a requirement they've had for a long time. And they should at least be doing that. I personally think it should go further, and it should also monitor work that does come in allocated, because those are also question marks there. But yeah, they should be doing it already, and they need to do that. And I've seen that some chambers do that. Some chambers also, I heard of at least one that has, I think, everybody's income up on a board, which I thought was quite interesting. I was like, wow. So if you're at the bottom, you might be a bit like, oh dear, might need to do a bit more work. But they're that transparent. I think that's in the more commercial end. So that's something that needs to happen. But in terms of whether it's just a chambers problem, I think it also extends to solicitors as well. And I have spoken about that before. I and others have also asked the Bar Council to work with the Law Society to tackle this, because it's a culture problem. There was a few years ago, Rihanna Popal, she tweeted about the fact that she had done a hearing, and she was told by the solicitor that they didn't want her to do the return hearing because the client wanted a white barrister. So, and that's one of those instances where the solicitor actually said it. I'm sure most of the time it's not said, but these things happen because most people aren't silly enough to say these things. So I think there is a massive problem on the other side of our profession. I've heard through WhatsApp groups from black solicitors, saying that they've worked in firms where they've decided, other solicitors there have decided not to instruct certain barristers, black barristers, because of the optics on a particular case. These things are happening, and those conversations are happening in firms. So there's only so much that we can do at the bar. We also need to go to our sister profession and say, we need to sort this out together.
Yeah.
Neil, can I just come in on that particular point? Look, we don't have data for everything, but we have data for a lot of things. And the old saying, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, is very apt in this context. If you look at the earnings levels of different barristers from different groups, particularly minority barristers, as we've heard already, if you look at the number of barristers from black and brown backgrounds getting silk, if you look at the number of black and black barristers and women as well, for that matter, who are becoming judges and getting into the senior judiciary, the evidence speaks for itself. So you can make a backwards calculation that unless there is some aspect of being a black or brown barrister or a woman or someone of a certain sexuality or someone who's disabled, that means inherently you are less capable of assuming a higher income earning level or being a silk or getting into the judiciary. If you put aside any nonsense like that, then the evidence speaks for itself. Second point is this: the relationship between clerks and solicitors is tight as you could imagine. Now, one of the legacies of having a bar, and particularly since tonight we're talking about the publicly funded bar, one of the legacies of having a bar into which people from minority backgrounds and women have come in quite late historically into this organization. So we're talking about the movement of women and minorities into the bar over the last, say, 30 years. That's when you've seen the growth period. A lot of the people who were clerking back in the days when there were very few black and brown barristers and women actually operating on the field are still around. They're senior clerks. They're senior clerks up and down the country. What they grew up with and what they were comfortable with when they were junior clerks and senior junior clerks before they became senior clerks is working with white men. And they became very comfortable in that cozy relationship. And so what would happen is, if you were a white male coming through the system 20, 30 years ago, you would have been groomed through the system by the clerks so as to be introduced to solicitors who could provide you with good quality work that would pay well. And those people who were doing that then are still in operation now. And so in a sense, the progress that we will make is a function of having a churn within the clerking system, so that the younger clerks, who tend to be much more switched on about issues of the importance of diversity, will grow up through the system and have more say. But the legacy we are dealing with is a virtuous circle. If you clerk people at the beginning of their career by introducing them to solicitors, that virtuous circle simply becomes stronger and stronger throughout your career. So those same white firms, broadly speaking, who have good quality work will continue to help you through your career into silk and beyond, all right? But if you don't get that access early on, you're left to fend for yourself. And if you speak to Natasha or to myself or Laurie-Anne and countless others who are from minority backgrounds, they will tell you the same story. I have been clerking myself pretty much from when I started. I had to go out there and fend for myself. I had to go out there and forage. I had to go and make my connections with solicitor firms. Often it was with solicitor firms who were themselves minorities who had some sympathy for my predicament, knowing full well that I wasn't getting a fair crack of the whip. And that means that I have basically built up my practice almost solo, notwithstanding the fact that I'm inside a chambers where I should be getting help and support. So we've got to break that virtuous circle in the sense that clerks need to understand, but very importantly, as both Natasha and Laurie-Anne have pointed out, solicitors need to understand that stop doing things the way that you've always done them just because your mate is the senior clerk in a chambers and you particularly like that senior practitioner who you've used since he was a baby. Stop doing that. Try other people out. Give them an opportunity. Give them a chance. They will prove themselves to you if you give them that. But if you don't, you're leaving them to languish and to fend for themselves, and that's simply not fair. So the point I made earlier about the help that you should have across the bar, not just through the different specialist bar associations, but internally within the criminal bar and internally within the family bar, must be a recognition by solicitors, clerks, and practitioners on the inside, particularly those who are pulling the levers of power like heads of chambers, that you've got to act in concert to give the youngsters a chance to have access to good quality work. It's not fair to leave them out in the cold. And equally important, don't abandon them after the first 5 years. See them through, as you've seen white male practitioners in past years, see them through to 5 to 10 years call, 10 to 15 years call, because this is where we are seeing, and we all recognize, we are seeing the drop-off level, particularly of women and of many minority barristers, above about 5 years call, going up to about 15 years call, when they simply cannot sustain a viable practice. And they have the angst and the feeling of being left out and being abandoned and treated unfairly. It's a difficult emotional reckoning to have to deal with, that you're at bar school with, as you did and is the same call, is earning 50% more than you are, or 100% more than you are. And not because they're better than you, but because they've been given more opportunities than you. And this is all that black and brown barristers and women have ever asked for, was an equal playing field. They haven't had it. And so one of the things we've got to do as we come out of COVID is to find a way to make...
Well, I mean, we're talking so far of work distribution and equal work distribution, but let's actually go right to the start. Alex Ferguson believed in youngsters, but let's go to the start of the youngsters at the bar, and that's not necessarily age. We're talking experience here. Pupillages. Now, we all know, even before COVID, how getting a pupillage was difficult. What do you think, because of COVID and the legacy of COVID, has that affected pupillages, and how can we address this? Natasha?
It's had a profound effect on pupillages, and I've had a look at some of the statistics. Apparently in 2020, so last year, 386 pupillages were registered, and that compared to 592 in 2019. So that's a fall of 33%, so 35%. And in 2020 and 2019, through the pupillage gateway, there was a massive drop in the number of pupillages available. Just looking at this year's recruitment round, there were 246 pupillage places available and 3,301 candidates applying. So that's not the number of applications. I think the number of applications was over 20,000, but that was the number of candidates that were actually making applications for those 230 odd pupillages. So it's been a massive, massive reduction in pupillages out there. And it's a massive problem. It's a problem that exists for all candidates. But in my opinion, it could potentially have a severe impact on those of us who are ethnic minorities. We all know the statistics from the BSB, which essentially show that white candidates are twice as likely to get pupillage than black candidates. If you look at it from a statistical perspective, if there hasn't been any culture change at the bar, in respect of how we could expect there to be even less in the number of black people obtaining pupillage than there has been before. So it's going to have a profound effect on diversity at the bar. I am extremely concerned. I have no doubt that the drop off in the number of pupillages, a lot of them have come from chambers which are in the publicly funded area, because those chambers themselves have been struggling. Those are the areas that you have more ethnic minority barristers and applicants as well. So it's going to be awful. I hope we bounce back, and I completely endorse what Joe has said earlier about the importance of diversity at the bar. I think there's going to be a real gap, and I'm concerned.
Laurie-Anne, as someone who works with the Bar Council and volunteers in this area, do you share those concerns as well?
Yeah, I do. I have this is an area that I think we really need to kind of particularly focus on, because I think that just in terms of entry level to the profession, it's such a difficult process for Black and Asian barristers to enter the profession. I think the fact that pupillages are falling, I think they will, I mean, the numbers picked back up because obviously the significant drop was as a consequence of COVID. So 2020, the figures dropped significantly. They've picked back up a little bit just in terms of applications, but the concern is this: Black and Asian barristers predominantly apply to the legally aided, so the crime family, and because that's where that they're received, the most. So applications will be the highest to those areas. If the places are being culled in those areas because of the impact of COVID, the people that are going to be culled first are the people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And I've seen firsthand. So last year, I'm head of pupillage in my chambers, and I have been for a number of years. And this year we had our pupillage applications were up by 25%, but the number of applications from diverse backgrounds was significantly down. And I saw that through the process for the application process. And so it tells me one of two things. It's already a massive risk to apply to come to the legally aided bar. When you're coming into a profession against the backdrop of, on average, £60,000 worth of debt, you've got to make that choice wisely. If you already pre-pandemic face statistics like the statistics that Natasha just referred to, so essentially you're half as likely to get a pupillage when you present with the same qualifications. You compound that with the 60-odd thousand pounds worth of debt. A lot of prospective pupils have suffered because of the pandemic in terms of doing the BPTC or the bar training course, in being able to afford to complete these courses. Many of these institutions started these courses, took the same amount of money, they turned out to be virtual courses, and of course, because people haven't been able to work during the pandemic, they haven't necessarily been able to, I know a number of people that haven't been able to pay for the courses in order to complete the courses so that they can go on to apply for pupillages the following year. So there are a number of different external financial factors that make applying to the legally aided bar even more risky than it was before. And so I think we're going to see a decline in numbers. I mean, the numbers were up by 0.1% just in terms of the overall across the profession. The number of people from diverse backgrounds, ethnically diverse backgrounds, was up by 0.1%, which is negligible, but it's a rise in any event. But we have to be careful because, of course, from 2018, I think it was, you can now apply for 20 pupillage places as opposed to 12. So we have to be careful that we don't put an artificial slant on the statistics and think that actually we're doing better than we are. Yes, the applications are up, but it's because people can apply to 20 chambers instead of 12 chambers. And so I think we just have to kind of take a measured approach to this. Will Black minority ethnic barristers across the board be detrimentally impacted by the effect of COVID? Absolutely yes, unequivocally yes. It's more likely that they will either not apply, and it's far more likely that if they do apply, they're not going to get pupillage. It's even more likely that if they get pupillage, they're not going to stay, because not because they don't want to, but because, as I said on the CLAR review a couple of weeks ago, staying at the criminal bar against a background of in excess of £65,000 of work is not a financially viable option. It's unsustainable. And so we're going to lose some fantastic people to either other areas of the profession, or they're going to leave the profession altogether. So I think that this is perhaps the real problem of COVID, is going to be in terms of access, and not necessarily social mobility once we're in the profession. I think access to the profession is where we're going to be hit the hardest. I wouldn't advise my child to come to the criminal bar if she'd left university and had £60,000 worth of debt and was going to go into a profession where she's likely to receive at least half of what you could get if you went into an employed position, minus the benefits, the pension, the maternity leave, or the insurances, the holiday, and not having a mental breakdown by the time you hit 10 years core. And so I think at the moment, the bar, and particularly the criminal bar, is the least attractive across the board. And I think we need to work on that. We need to work on that.
Yeah, Joe, Laurie-Anne mentions problems and difficulties entering the bar. Obviously, I'd like you to address that, but also to address another aspect, which is the retention, because I saw a recent survey, 18% of self-employed barristers would like to leave the bar. I mean, is that as COVID
would be higher than that? Sorry.
Well, how difficult it is to actually become a barrister. To still 20% will want to leave. I mean, has COVID had that detrimental effect, Joe?
I think the point I was making earlier, Neil, about COVID accentuating a problem or aggravating a problem, but not actually creating a new problem, applies here as well. We've had levels of attrition from the criminal bar, and I'm sure from the family bar as well, over many, many years. The people that we tend to lose are those who, of course, have invested a huge amount of their lives, both in terms of time, energy, and of course in money, to a career which they had, starry-eyed as they were when they were at bar school, imagined would be their last place of work. It wouldn't be a place that they would abandon after 5 or 10 years. But the reality is, of course, that the grueling experience for many people, and particularly for women at the bar, and for minority women at the bar who are paid the least amount of money, it's worth repeating, is that when at certain junctures in their career, for example, if after say 10 years call, they're thinking about having a family and they want to step away from the bar for a period of time, it's extraordinarily difficult for them to contemplate coming back to the bar because they haven't been able to build up a fund that will allow them to be able to pay for childcare and be able to come back into work. And so this is one of the realities of a structural imbalance within our system, whereby those like us three who are on screen now, who predominantly do publicly funded work, find ourselves especially vulnerable when there are certain points in life when you really need to have a healthy bank balance. So attrition is an acute problem and it's not going away anytime soon. But attrition of people through the inability of our institutions to retain them simply is the other side of the coin to the problem of recruitment. And I just want to come back to that for a moment, because we have information that helps us to understand how bad the problem is. Very recently, Neil, the Bar Standards published a report, in fact, in February of this year, which was analysing the impact of the health emergency on the supply of pupillage places. And it showed that the number of pupillages offered in 2020 had fallen by 35% compared with 2019. And there are some reasons that we may feel hopeful that that problem can be turned around in 2021. But the current indications coming from our regulator is that the supply of places will not bounce back this year and may not even, in fact, bounce back next year to the level of 2019 or preceding years. And if one thinks back to last year, and I recall doing an article for Council Magazine with Elaine Banton on this very issue, and we noted in that article in Council Magazine that the number of pupillages that had been provided through Gateway, which accounts for about 50% of all the offers made of pupillage, had dropped in 2019 from it to a figure of 135. That's 135 in 2020, dropped from 216 in 2019, which was a massive drop through Gateway. And it meant that at the end of that application process, applicants only had a 7% chance of getting an offer. Now, when you marry that to the point that's been made by Natasha and Laurie-Anne previously about the differential success rate for people of color compared to people who are white, the actual figures are these, that if you are from a Black, Asian, or minority ethnic background, your prospects of getting a pupillage offer were 3.3%. But if you were white, it was 8.7%. And so there we have a problem that whilst we're trying to build a bar at the bottom end that is more representative of society more broadly, when we have that choking off of pupillage places, it's not a problem which is being faced equally by all the applicants. The ones who are going to get the worst of it, the ones who've already had the worst of it, which are those who are applicants of color. And that means that what we are looking at now is almost a false reality. What we've got to imagine is, what's the world going to be like in publicly funded work at the criminal and family bars, respectively, in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, in 15 years' time? If there were grounds for being concerned about the lack of Black people in the senior judiciary, if there were grounds for being concerned about the fact that Black people had less prospect of taking silk than even brown people at the English bar, and that's a problem today, imagine what will happen if we don't have those sorts of people, women and minorities, being recruited at the bottom end because of the choking off of pupillage places as a result of COVID and because of a historical trend. If we see that falling away, we are facing a world in which in 5 or 10 years' time, we're going to have a less diverse bar. Imagine that, a less diverse bar than the one that we have even today. And that's the backward slide that all of us are really, really concerned with. That's why it needs a concerted effort. We need the BSB to be involved in this process of thinking out of the box about how we can bump up the number of pupillage places, how we can make sure that those pupillage places are allocated fairly and distributed equally amongst all the sorts of people who apply for them, and make sure that individual chambers, when they are making those selections, when they are whittling down those application forms, selecting who comes in for interview and interviewing them, that they have very much in the back of their mind, if not at the forefront of their mind, they have that understanding that we have an obligation also to the wider bar as individual chambers and practitioners to build a diverse population of men and women. That's important. That's a laudable goal, and that's something we have to work towards. Otherwise, we will find ourselves heading back towards the 1950s when the bar looked like a very different place altogether.
Yeah, so I think all three of you are urging the addressing of that problem now. Otherwise, we're just simply storing it up for the future, which would look very different. Yeah, okay, well, that's been really interesting. I want to perhaps move on because we've received quite a few questions from our audience. I want to try and pick out a few just to get the panelists' views on them. One question, which perhaps is a little bit different and light-hearted, but still quite important, given the recent events. I'll be interested to hear what are the panelists' views on the recent change after discovering Lord Harwick was a co-author of a 1729 legal opinion, which was relied on by slave owners, to change the name of Hardwicke Chambers to Gatehouse Chambers. Natasha, what do you feel about that? There's been a lot on Twitter about it.
There has been a lot on Twitter, and it's funny because I was hoping to come back to the previous question. The reason why I'm smiling is because I can link the two.
Okay.
Apparently, that's what we can do. But yes, I think it was a good thing. I do note that they are also moving, so it's quite convenient. But I also think it was a bold move. I think it was a great move. I think it was nice to see. I think some people may say it's virtue signaling, but I think you have to remember that we are in a very conservative, with a small c, profession. And I don't think we would have seen that kind of move in 2019, for example. So I think it's really great. Some of the responses are interesting. And then this is where I can do my quick segue, because one of my concerns in respect of pupillage is I've been told by people that a lot of Black applicants have been put off the bar because of two things. So one, because of conversations that we as practitioners are having about race, bringing up the fact that there is racism and discrimination in the profession is putting people off because they think, I don't want to come to this place if I'm going to be less likely to earn X than this person, or I'm going to experience microaggressions, etc. The second is barristers saying racist and borderline racist things on Twitter and other social media platforms. And that sort of comes to the responses that we may have seen on Twitter in respect of Hardwicke. So I think what they did is a great move. I think it's going to be encouraging for applicants, because I think they're going to see that actually the bar is changing and trying to change. And hopefully they'll get lots of Black applicants because they're a fantastic set. Hopefully they'll recruit some of them too. But I do think that we need to watch how we speak. I really do, because sometimes people say things which are a bit ridiculous, and sometimes people just need to say nothing at all.
Laurie-Anne, I mean, this social media and race is a very difficult area. Do you think it's one that needs to be really policed with care?
I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because, you know, we promote freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and freedom of opinion. And I think that it's very difficult to police that. I think Natasha's absolutely right. People need to think before they type, which is why I'm not on Twitter, because I would probably be in lots of problems right now. But yeah, I'm on Instagram because it takes so long before you post anything. You normally you've calmed down by then. But I think we do need to think, I think just in terms of Hardwick, I think that it's a very small move, but it has a huge significance. Like I say, we are living in a profession, operating in a profession that was built upon the backs of institutions like this, of slave owners, of colonialism. We walk around our inns and our temples and our chambers that have been built on the backs of, on the back of oppression. And we either don't know, we don't care. And I think what it has, it's the Colston effect, isn't it? It has the effect of keeping us where we are. And I think that when people recognize that actually this is wrong, and it might just be changing a name, but it's the reason we're changing the name that matters. I think more of it, please. More of it, and in line with it's a cumulative effect of chambers like Hardwick Chambers doing what Natasha's absolutely right would not even have been an option in 2019. And this is what we call changing a culture. People change culture, culture doesn't change people. So if a chambers like Hardwick says it's not right for us to continue the legacy of a man who built an empire on the back of slavery, and we're not doing it, other people will follow. And so I think it's important. We are slowly changing a culture by this gentle but consistent movement. And so, yeah, I think, social media is a problem for many, many reasons. I think that it's very difficult for us to police it, but I think that people, like Natasha says, need to think before they tweet.
Yeah, but where do we stop? Because we had that recently, an England cricketer who
Ollie Robinson.
Yeah, exactly. Who had tweeted when he was much younger, difficult, racist things, sexist things. So where do we stop? Because he's now much older. He says changed, and he is very remorseful. But he did it when he was a youth.
Neil,
when a black kid is stopped 15 times in a week and receives a caution for a knife and goes to get a job when he's 27, that caution for a knife was not just a blight. It's something that will have the impact of damaging his future. And so people, everyone, no matter what you do, where you come from, need to recognize that every action has a reaction and a consequence. And we cannot at any level be seen to be light on or take a light touch to obviously openly racist behavior. What he said was reprehensible. And there are some things where you would, being a defense lawyer, mitigate his behavior, but what he said is who he is. And in fact that he said on the platform that to people who perhaps didn't take a particularly adverse view to it, tells you a lot about who he is as a person. He might be a different person now, but I'm sorry you said it. These are the consequences of it, and it's not one rule for one or one rule for the other. So people need to recognise that their actions have consequences.
Do you agree, Joe?
I think, to state the obvious, there's a difference between the living and the dead. The living can be reformed and rehabilitated and re-educated and rewired and made to understand why their past behaviour in fact is unacceptable. I'm a great believer in the ability of human beings to reform themselves if they're guided correctly. I don't think we should throw anyone on the scrap heap. Bar some really grotesque examples. Most people, I think, mature as they get older. The issue about, Edward Colston in Bristol, and some of you may have watched the programme last night, two statues, I think it was called. about the experience of the Bristol mayor, who is a black man, Marvin Rees, of dealing with that particular problem. That threw up a lot of issues. Cecil Rhodes in Oxford, another issue, another person who benefited from slavery financially and was able to disperse money to others and then use no doubt the guise of being a philanthropist as somehow covering up for his moral behavior or immoral behavior. I think we could get into a number of examples. Hardwick's another one. Each case has to be decided obviously on its own merits. It's up to the local people and the people who are affected to be able to voice their opinions about it. But if we are in the bar, and then let's say there is a chambers which has a name, as Hardwick has, which quite clearly is associated with somebody who may have been involved in slavery, I think there is a common sense approach to take that if you want to encourage your members of your chambers and other people elsewhere, people who are not quite at the stage of applying for the bar and people who may be in other chambers who want to move to your chambers, then try and at least make the name of your chambers feel like a place where they will be welcome. You know, we still have all men's clubs in London. We used to have all men's colleges in certain universities in this country. That's all now been put into the past and should be put into the past. Why would we want to continue having a chambers that's named after someone who is associated with slavery? That's the question to ask. But Neil, the more important point for me, at least, about the conundrum that we face in trying to present the criminal bar, the family bar, and the bar more generally as an attractive, welcoming place for newcomers to enter is this, and it's the one that Laurie-Anne's put her finger on. It's the eternal dilemma of people like me and Natasha and Laurie-Anne who want to be able to encourage people like ourselves to come to the bar, but also feel a moral duty to alert them to the problems that we are having internally. I'm a great believer in relying upon the common sense and maturity of young men and women who are thinking about a career at the bar. And I keep saying young men and women, but of course, there are many people who come into the bar at different ages, but you understand what I mean. That people who are coming into the bar, the best thing you can do for them is to give them accurate, reliable, good quality information in order to make a sensible, mature adult decision for themselves. So that if you tell them that their prospects of getting pupillage are very low, don't hide that from them, because before they part with £18,000 of their money or take out a loan, they must know what their chances are, broadly speaking, of getting into the bar. It's important to tell them also that we do have issues that we are still trying to work our way through about the way in which minorities are treated differentially at the bar, and particularly Black people at the bar, because they are getting the worst of it, of all of us. And I think that's important to tell young Black men and women who are thinking about coming to the bar that this is actually the reality also on the inside. But you texture that and you balance that with also informing them about the great strides we are making, positive strides, to address these problems, that we have our groups that give support to you, that we are in contact with the powers that be, and that the powers that be have expressed many, many times their belief that diversity matters to them as well, and that these aren't just words. So give that information to the person who is thinking about coming to the bar, be honest with them, but texture it so you give them both sides of it. And if you do that, let that 22, 23-year-old, or indeed 50-year-old who's thinking about coming to the bar, make an informed decision, and on their head be it, if it doesn't work for them, but not for the lack of being given the guidance that they so desperately crave for.
Yeah.
And I would very briefly add to that, that what I like to say to them as well is our profession, we're actually having the conversation. There are so many professions out there, if you just look at the city, where they're not even at that stage yet. So the fact that we're even having the conversation shows that we're aware and we're trying to do something about it. A lot of the times where you have these problems is where they're not even allowed to have the conversation because they don't want to face the racism that's going on. So we're in a good place at the moment at the bar, and we're hopefully gonna make some change.
Yeah. Well, Natasha, you talk about the awareness. I was interested in what you said a little bit earlier about virtual signalling, and we've had a few questions about this. Obviously, during the past year, we've had the pandemic problems exacerbated by the BLM movements. You could argue that some of the statements made by organizations out there have felt a bit like virtual signalling. How do you think organisations can better support minority groups?
Well, they need to do better. They need to change their culture. They also need to recruit. They need to promote. They need to retain. They need to encourage ethnic minority groups. It's as simple as that. You can say what you want to say about, oh, you know, we believe in diversity, because I've said it by force, for example, at the bar, we have to have an equality and diversity statement on our websites or wherever. So I've said it by force. We actually have to believe and actually do something about it. I think that is where the real stuff happens. And it's quite interesting as well, because I find a lot of people will gravitate to times where people will just say things. So they'll say things, sometimes in talks. I mean, maybe I'm just saying things now. They'll say things on Twitter, but the real work happens behind closed doors. Joe knows this, Laurie-Anne knows this, because we all sit on several committees where we're actually sitting there looking at things. The race working group, for example, we're looking at things like positive action. We're looking at things like getting data. We're actually trying to create the policies that will go out to chambers, that hopefully chambers will do. All of that big work is not the work that you can shout out and scream about and look fantastic with. That's the nitty-gritty things that you may not get thanks for initially. You'll get it eventually when your statistics look better, hopefully, but you may not get it initially. But that's the really important work, and I think organisations need to sit and do that.
Joe, as a vice chair of the CBA, how do you think organisations can better support minority barristers?
I think the first thing is they need to listen to minority barristers, Neil. The first step you must take is not to assume things about what the experiences are of women and minority barristers, whether they're doing criminal work or family work or indeed any other type of work. Listen to them first. Secondly, take on board the good work that's done, not just within the bar, but outside the bar. There are great lessons we can learn from other sectors of our society where diversity has been propagated effectively and efficiently. And we need to learn the lessons from what they are doing and not be too pompous or too arrogant about our ability to deliver those sorts of results for our own people within our family of barristers. Thirdly, we need to set up structures that allow people from minority backgrounds and women to be able to ascend through the ranks progressively. And that means, of course, ensuring that they stay within the profession, that they don't leave because of lack of financial support or they're not being clerked properly. But it also means that their psychological well-being is being taken care of. Everyone at the bar, as you asked at the outset of this evening, Neil, has suffered in consequence of COVID to a lesser or greater degree. But the psychological impact of already being part of the downtrodden and then finding that your life has spiraled further down is immeasurable. You can't imagine how hard it must be to be a minority, particularly a minority woman at the bar, already saddled with debt, already saddled with low expectations of your future and not being given a fair crack of the whip, to then be hit by something like COVID and find that actually you might just want to give up the ghost. It's not worth carrying on. How do we encourage those people to stay within the fold? We need to give them a supportive environment. We also need to make sure that they aren't distracted and upset by the behavior of a very small minority amongst us, the kinds of people that we've heard about recently who tweet such offensive remarks. We've got to drive those people either out of the bar or get them to understand that you can't carry on behaving like that in 2021. You shouldn't have been behaving like that 50 years ago, let alone now in the 21st century. And that means, as we've heard already this evening, generating a cultural change, an atmosphere. Now, I've always believed, Neil, that if you get more women into the bar and you get more minorities into the bar, the sheer presence, the physical presence of those individuals will of itself have a positive impact on the atmosphere and the culture within which we work at the bar. When you go to a court robing room, if you see women there, if you see people of color there, if you yourself are a woman of color, you will feel emboldened and encouraged by that. So in order to make sure that those people don't leave the bar, aren't disenchanted or put off by the behavior of a few, make sure that we keep their numbers up. This is why it's so critical not to ignore the structural imbalances, because if we don't arrest the decline in the number of pupillages and we don't promote minorities and women throughout all the tiers of the bar, the problem we will have is that we will then be struggling even harder to encourage newcomers to be part of it, because the minute those mini pupils turn up to a court trial and they have a look around and they see that their mini pupil supervisor buys them a cup of coffee, takes them into court and says to them, this is the kind of work that you'll be doing, and they look around and see no one who looks like them, I'm afraid at that point, that person will feel defeated. No matter how hard you try to bring them in and to give them opportunities, it'll already be too late.
Laurie-Anne, Joe talks about increasing women, which would really assist. I mean, obviously, you're on the committee of women in criminal law. That no doubt helps to try and encourage and support increasing their access to the legal profession.
Yes, but I think that there are significant differences between white women and women who are Black and Asian. And, we are as Black and Asian women treated almost as though we are a different species. And that is also by white women. And, and sometimes I actually think that we are treated worse by other white women than white men. So, being a woman, so when people say increase the numbers of women, we can't include us in that, because people don't think about us when they're thinking about increasing women. Black women are at the bottom of every single statistical analysis that has been conducted. And that's at the expense to no one, but they're certainly at the advantage to others. And so I think when I think about elevating women, obviously collectively, but in particular, Black women and Asian women, I think about, and having gone through it, my own personal experience of coming to the bar as a very, very young single mother and working through the bar with coming from an unconventional background with very little support, coming into a profession where there was no support other than through my inn who gave me a scholarship, but where there was no support amongst my peer groups. The last thing on my mind was social mobility and career progression. I was just thinking about, how am I going to get to court? When am I going to get paid that check? And can I feed my kids tonight? And while it might not be as extreme for some people, those distractions still exist today, 21 years later. Am I going to get that brief? Am I going to earn enough money this month to meet my rent? Am I going to be able to pay, for my child's holiday or whatever, and so when it comes to career progression, it falls down a very long list of priorities. So for example, the process of applying for Silk, it's a process that takes about 5 years, but you need the support system. You need to be in cases with other people who say to you, you should be applying, where judges are saying to you, I'll be your referee. But if you're not getting that kind of work at 15, 16, 17 years call, there's no way you're going to be in a position to apply once you hit 18, 19, 20 years call. And the reason why is that because of the disproportionate levels of clerking, but also because of all of the other external factors that we have to deal with as marginalized people within our own profession. And I maintain, and I say this at every given opportunity, I absolutely live for this job. As far as I'm concerned, it is the best job in the world. And I feel privileged to be able to go and be a mouthpiece for people who don't have a voice of their own. And I love it, but it makes it very, very difficult to stay. And so we need to continue this, continue to support our own. For those people, if there are any young people listening, if there are any pupils listening, if there are any people who are thinking about how to progress, step up and ask, approach, email, just reach out, because that's what we're here for. We need to support each other through this. And so I think, yes, there is a lot of scope to be optimistic. I think we've got a very, very long way to go, but I think we're doing all the right things.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating discussion so far. Lots of questions. Some of the discussions that we've had carried the answers. But obviously there are many more, and we can talk certainly for a few hours. Sadly, we haven't got that. But I think before we go, we spoke last year of a need of there to be a fundamental shift in the bar to tackle problems faced by ethnic minority barristers. Joe, do you think there has been?
I think that the concentrated effort that we have been making over a number of years has not dissipated. I think we're still very much on the job. We are very watchful, we're very vigilant. I think that when we have little upsets, when someone tweets something, I think it's a reminder to us that for every person who has the gall to tweet something offensive about people's race, there must be a huge number of other people who would not have reached for their phone and done that, but are thinking pretty much the same thing. So I sort of gauge the progress that we make by the number of upsets and bumps on the road that we have from the beginning of one year to the next. I've sensed that we have fewer and fewer bumps. I think that we're doing better. Speaking across the country through different circuits to people who are at the criminal bar, I get the impression that the generation, which is the sort of maybe under 40 generation, do have a different outlook on the world. They've grown up, many of them, in schools that were diverse and universities that were diverse. Laurie-Anne, of course, is one of the under 40 generation, as she's just helpfully pointed out. And I think, therefore, there's reason to be optimistic. Of course, the counterweight to that is that the people who really hold most of the institutional power within the profession and the judiciary aren't under 40. They are people who are older, who come from a different generation. So the real task, I feel, for us is to be able to get that message across to people who grew up in a generation and at a time when they weren't actually wired to be sensitive to issues of diversity, and often quite the contrary. And those are the people that we need to ensure remain on side in this difficult process that we are going through, and that we have the leadership from them so that they set down a tone and a marker for the rest of the profession to say to them, this is how we expect you to be behaving in terms of respecting the importance of diversity within our profession, and that there is a sense of, dare I say it, zero tolerance of racism, of sexism, of homophobia, of being anti-disabled, or any of the other conditions which continue to afflict wider society. We are, in a sense, operating within a kind of vacuum. I've said this before, Neil. We've tricked ourselves at the bar into thinking somehow, because we're barristers and we're all into fairness and the interests of justice and all of that sort of thing, that we are immune, if not impervious, to some of these pressures that we have outside of racial intolerance and those sorts of things, but we're not. We are just men and women who carry within each of us the experiences that we've loaded up over the decades that we've lived. And some of us are going through a re-education process and understanding that many of the beliefs that we held actually aren't appropriate to hold anymore. And if the bar can act as a spearhead for that, as a vanguard for change, then it will be respected across society as an institution that sets the standard. And that's what I'm looking to see from our leadership. That's what I'm looking for from our troops. That's what I hope to see over the next 5 or 10 years. But the structural challenges are there, and we're going to have to keep our eye on them.
But Laurie-Anne, do you think there's been a fundamental shift?
Yes, I do. You know, I think how fundamental is probably, you know, something that we're going to have to see. But I think the tide is turning. I think the tide is turning. I think we have to just keep a close eye on things, and, you know, not take our eye off the ball. We can't afford to stop now. You know, there are people that have gone before us that have made huge sacrifices, that didn't have what we have here together now, that had to do it alone. I think we owe it to them, and certainly to the future generation. But I certainly feel a positive shift.
And last word to you, Natasha.
It's a tricky one to answer, because on the one hand, I think there has been a shift. As I said before, we are actually talking about race. Before, we only really spoke about women, and as Laurie-Anne said, it was about white women. We never spoke about race at all at the bar. It was almost a dirty word. So the fact that we're doing that, and we're actively doing that too, makes me think that there has been change. In respect of BBN, we've had lots of different organisations reach out to us, including the Ministry of Justice. We've been involved with CLAR and all that sort of stuff, which has been fantastic for them to recognise that they need to hear the voices of Black barristers when it comes to things like this. this. Another example would be the Black Barristers Network. We've got an upcoming roundtable with leaders of FLBA and CBA. Joe, if you don't know, it should be in your diary. We're going to be talking about the survey and the report that we did on the experiences of self-employed barristers, and hopefully coming up with some change. So that's a great thing. And then the race working group, and of course I'm on Lincoln's Inn's EDI committee, and we're going to be doing some fantastic things there. However, on the other hand, the flip side is our general, when I look at our general day-to-day experiences, I think of my life at the bar practicing. I'm like, okay, everything's actually okay right now in respect of the experiences I have from other people. However, I've sort of noticed that a lot of barristers, particularly white barristers, are quite excited about going back to court. And I've spoken to my black barrister friends about it, and I've been like, why are these people so excited to go back to court? All the camaraderie, roving room banter, I don't understand. And then one of my friends said to me, you know, if it was just black barristers that we were going to see at court, then it would be a vibe. It would be great. I wouldn't mind going back to court. And then that also made me think that having virtual court has shielded me to an extent from all of the racism, the discrimination, the microaggressions that we get day to day in court, either from court staff or from opponents, because there's limited time to speak to opponents before or after hearings, from judges to an extent, although they can still sort of perpetrate it through the screen, and things like that. So I think maybe, as I said before, culture, the change of the culture is really what we need in order for everything else to hopefully fall into place. I think I'll only really get a sense of whether the culture has changed when I have to be in the physical presence of other non-ethnic minority barristers. I'm concerned because I see the stuff on Twitter and I'm just like, wow, wow, you guys are still out there. And I hope I'll never have to come up against you. But we'll see. I think the work that we're doing in terms of the organizations that we're all a part of is fantastic. I just really hope that it trickles down, because I think we're all in these organizations and therefore we think that things are doing really well because we're doing so much work into them. But really it's chambers and individual barristers that actually need to bring about the change. So I just hope it trickles down.
Yeah, no, I think wise words from all panelists. Positive steps, but with areas that still need work. So maybe a C+ on the report card. Well, all that remains for me to do is to thank all the panelists. It's been a fantastic, illuminating discussion. I also wish to thank the Lincoln's Inn Education, Clara for one, the EDI committee. They've really helped to put this forum together, and it couldn't be done without them. But ultimately, for you listening as well, thank you for taking up your evening and listening to us and being and providing such useful questions. I'm sorry we can't answer them all, but there we go. Time is against us. But thank you, and it just remains for me and the panelists to wish you all well and goodbye.
And just to add, special thank you to Neil for chairing so brilliantly as well. And this event has been recorded and we will be popping it onto the Lincoln's Inn media section of the website too, if anyone would like to rewatch or anyone who couldn't make it. Thank you so much.
Brilliant.